Hi everyone, thank you for coming to my stream today. Especially some of you who waited like a really long time. I'm sorry, the time was off. But today I'm going to be talking about absolute Russia. My name's Sherry. If you can't hear me, that's because I'm a little sick, sorry. But again, my name's Sherry and I'm going to be talking about absolute Russia and how that factors into AP Euro. So as always, make sure you guys follow at Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. We post really funny content and we promote different streams that we think you guys would appreciate for all your other AP classes. So in this stream, we're going to talk about what the age of absolutism actually is and why we talk about absolute Russia. Russia before the age of absolutism, Russia versus Western Europe, because they basically developed differently despite being on the same continent. Peter the Great, who is a prime example, who's the prime example of an absolute monarch for Russia, Peter's goals and how he reformed Russia. So what is the age of absolutism? Can you guys give me a definition in the chat for what you think absolutism means? Short definition is fine, but what do you guys think absolutism is? Yes, Jed. So absolutism is absolute or supreme power, but it's in someone's specific hands. So absolutism, as I define, this is my really basic definition, but basically the ruler is the state, which means they control the country. So their decisions determine how the country functions and no one can deny them. So basically absolute power. And the most iconic quote of this time period is Laissez-moi. I probably butcher that. I don't speak French. I'm so sorry. But that basically means I am the state, or the state is me. And can you guys guess who this was said by? In the chat, any guesses as to who said this very iconic line? Yes, good job, Julia. It is Louis XV. And his moniker, the reason why we consider him, the reason why I put him on here is because he's basically the poster child of the age of absolutism. He best exemplifies the traits of what an absolute ruler is. And, since he called himself the Sun King, and yeah, so basically he believed in divine right theory, and I didn't put it on the slide, but divine right theory is the idea that all rulers are chosen by God. So if you go against that ruler, you're basically going against God. And since religion plays such an important role in Europe at the time, and it will continue to play a big role into the future, divine right gave them it justified the rule of the monarchs and them to having so much power. So the age of absolutism. It's basically a period in Europe where monarchs successfully gain sole control of the wealth and power in a state. So monarchs could make any decision they needed, and nobles and other decision-making bodies were often too weak to stop them or to limit such power because the monarchs had done such a good job of limiting their powers. So there were no checks and balances for the monarchs. And since we're talking about Russia specifically, this was between 1682 to 1725 for Russia, the age of absolutism. Although absolutism had existed before this time period, this is when the most iconic absolutist ruler for Russia ruled. So we consider this to be the age of absolutism for Russia. And as I said before, Louis XV is Louis XIV, sorry. Louis XIV is the poster child for the age of absolutism due to his Sun King moniker and his traits. And that's Louis XV. I mean, Louis the 14th, I keep getting that mixed up. Louis the 14th, do take a note of how he dresses, which it seems pretty arbitrary right now, but it's going to be really important later on. I promise. So now I'm going to talk about Russia before the age of absolutism and what's basically happening in their country. You know, AP Euro focuses so much on Western Europe, but now we're getting into Eastern Europe, so it's time to see how they differ, basically. So first we have the Black Death, and as you guys know, you probably didn't go over this in class, but if you don't know what the Black Death is, it basically wiped out two-thirds of Europe's population. Yeah, so that wasn't good. And then another factor that affected how they developed was the conquering of their country by Mongols. So Mongols come from, or horseback like riding Asians, and they invaded China and Russia and all those countries. And they also played a really important part in how Russia developed. And then we have Ivan the Terrible, and I'm going to get into him after. So first we have the Black Death, and the Black Death, even though it killed like 2/3 of Europe's population, it did much worse than that. It ruined their economy because peasants were the most affected by it, and because they were most of Europe's population, and because they made up most of Europe's labor force, the labor force also diminished. So both the East and the West had to exploit peasants. But so they turned to serfdom, right? And do you guys know what serfdom is? Yes, no, thumbs up in the chat, thumbs down in the chat. Do you guys know what serfdom is? Yes? Okay. So I'm going to go over my kind of definition basically. So serfdom is like a type of slavery, but it's also not slavery. And that sounds like really confusing right now, but I promise it won't be. So serfdom is, instead of being considered property, they're not considered property. The peasants that were serfs aren't considered property like slaves, but they're bound to the land. So they have to work on that land. Basically, they're kind of like in debt to whoever owns the land. And so both countries had utilized serfdom at first, but it lost momentum in Western Europe. It just wasn't accepted there, basically. So it lost momentum in Western Europe, but throughout Eastern Europe, it persisted. And serfdom's going to play a really big part in how Russia revolutionizes itself and comes into being more modern. And then the Mongols, they invaded Russia long ago, before this happened, like 400 years ago. So as you can see, they invaded Russia in 1223. And they forced Russian princes and nobles at the time to be their tax collectors. So the Mongols invaded Russia and they formed a khanate, which is basically like an area that they control. So they formed that. And then they forced all the royalty there to be Russian princes and nobles to be their tax collectors from the peasants. And the Russian nobles had no choice but to agree, basically. And this put them on good standing between, this put the nobles and the Mongols on good standing because the nobles would personally go out of their way to reinforce collecting taxes for no reason, even though this hurt their own people, but they would reinforce tax collection just to have a good relationship. And they conquered Eastern Slavs for more than Slavs, not slaves, Slavs for more than 2 centuries. So the the Slavic people are like the Baltics and Russia and Poland, Lithuania, that area. Those are the Slavs. And they conquered that area for more than 2 centuries, up until the 1400s-ish. And then we get to Ivan the Terrible. So Ivan the Terrible is also known as Ivan the Fourth, and he threw off the reign of the Mongols, basically. He basically used his nobles back then used their relationship with the Mongols to assert power over the peasants. But what he did was that he used his relationship with the Mongols to assert the role of a czar or tsar, however you guys want to spell it, CZ or TS. however you guys want to spell it. But he's the one who created the role, and it's basically like the Slavic play on the word Caesar. So he created this like monarchy for Russia, and then he helped to throw off the Mongols and their influence. And Ivan the Terrible is a pretty terrible person. He limited peasant freedom and the power of the nobles, but he also expanded Russia. So he wasn't completely terrible. But after his death, there was a time of troubles. And the time of troubles is basically just a lot of civil war due to the lack of there being an heir for Ivan the Terrible. So this time of troubles, once it was resolved, it established the Romanov dynasty in 1613. And if you guys have heard of the Romanovs, they're going to be the Russian monarchy from the time of troubles to the end of the time of troubles to the Russian Revolution. So they're going to remain the monarchs for a long period of time, up for like another 300 years. So here's a map of Russia. And if you guys can't read the words, I'm going to like explain it to you really quick. So the faint yellow part that we see here, this was the only thing that existed for Russia. This was the only land that Russia had back then. So obviously it was easier for the Mongols to conquer. But this was Russia before Ivan the Terrible took control. And Ivan the Terrible, once he took control, he expanded a little bit westward, but mostly he expanded eastward, taking all of Siberia. So that's why Russia is such a large country as we know it today. He took Siberia because no other country wanted it, because if you don't know, Siberia is a particularly cold and not friendly and uninhabitable place that mostly exiles went to. So yeah, but this just all became Russian territory, and that's why it's the large country we know today, thanks to Ivan the Terrible. So now I'm going to talk about Russia versus Western Europe and how they developed differently. So we all know that they were affected by the Black Death, right? They all were affected. It destroyed Europe like as a whole, some of Asia too. But it's interesting how Western Europe and Russia still developed in extremely different paths, despite having faced the same set of circumstances. So I'm going to talk about that right now. So Russia is on the white side and Western Europe is on the blue. And here's a list of Russian traits. And here is a list of Western Europe's traits. So as I stated before, we have the most glaring difference is serfdom. One of the most glaring differences is serfdom. So as I said, Russia and Eastern Europe, not just Russia, that's important to note. But Russia, along with most of your Eastern Europe, they still accept serfdom. Putting peasants down and into servitude for like almost all of their lives was totally acceptable to them. While Western Europe just sought manual labor, they weren't particularly fond of serfdom. So it's not important to know why Western Europe threw off serfdom. It's just important to note that Western Europe doesn't have serfdom at the time. They haven't had it for a very long time, which makes Alexander the First's rule, when he comes into power, of getting rid of serfdom very influential, which you guys will probably learn later in the year. Secondly, we know the religion of Western Europe and Russia are different because Russia is mostly Russian Orthodox, and it's the Russian Orthodox Church. So they're still Catholic. It's the Catholic Church. So they're still Catholic, but their subgroup is called Russian Orthodox. While Western Europe was either the Catholic Church in the Vatican City or Protestant because of the Reformation, which you guys probably know by now. And Russia back then, up until the age of absolutism, they were not influential in the European balance of power at all. Can you guys tell me what you think the big countries in Europe at the time are? I can think of 3 main countries, but you guys can list more if you can think of them. Type in chat what you guys think are the main powers in Europe. And a hint is that it's none of the Eastern countries. France is one of them. Good job, Julia. I'm looking for at least 2 more. So 3 in total. We have France. Can I get another one, guys? The Holy Roman Empire would count, yeah. Even though it's made of multiple separate provinces, it still counts. Germanic states, it still counts. Holy Roman Empire. There's a very obvious one that starts with E. England, yes. So those are basically the main 3 that I was looking for. Spain could be included if you want, but it's diminishing in power. But yes, we have France, the Holy Roman Empire, and England. Those were the main powers at the time. And if you can tell from the previous map, well, you can't see it here, but they're all on the western side of the European continent. So that's why that side of Europe as a whole was very influential in the European balance of power. And many important events that you guys have previously learned about had limited effect on the country. While Western Europe, the Renaissance started in Italy, and the Reformation started in the Germanic states and the Holy Roman Empire, and the Age of Exploration started in Portugal and Spain. See how all those events centralize around Western Europe? And this isn't by coincidence, by the way. They were just more literate over there. They weren't landlocked like Russia is. We saw it's a very huge empire. It's very hard to maintain that much space. They're landlocked. There's barely any ocean near them that has significant trade. So yeah, that was a big problem. While Spain and Portugal were next to the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, all those areas. So places like the Renaissance, while they did affect Russia, it didn't have as much influence as it should have compared to places like Western Europe. Reformation didn't really affect the Russian Orthodox belief in Russia, and the Age of Exploration, Russia couldn't utilize any of these new passageways and discoveries about the New World except for the colonizing Alaska. And Russia is extremely old-fashioned and focused on tradition, while Western Europe is modernized and more developed. So there's going to be a picture that comes up later that's going to compare Western Europe and Russia's culture, and I'm going to ask you guys if you can see any differences in a future slide. But what I mean by old-fashioned is that they still hadn't changed. They still hadn't changed their clothing, their culture, the way they wore. They had facial hair, any of that, their customs. While Western Europe began opening education for everyone, they had new clothes, tea parties, all of that. So can anyone tell me what this picture is of, who this picture represents? Don't be afraid to guess. He's not the common... He's a face you should know, but it's okay if you don't. Any guesses? No? Okay, so this is a picture of Peter the Great. And Peter the Great is the monarch we associate with Europe during the age of absolutism. So I'm going to basically list his background off in this slide so you guys can learn a little bit of his influences and why his motives are all about reforming Russia. So Peter the Great, and here's a little fun fact, people who are named the Great probably didn't do great things, but in my opinion, Peter the Great did do great things for Russia. So he was born Pyotr Romanov, as I said, the Romanov dynasty. And he basically came into power fairly young, and he went to Western Europe specifically England. He went to Western Europe to learn new stuff about their culture because he wanted to expand Russian territory. And he was always at war with Turkey and Holland during his reign. And they had really strong navies and armies, so he needed to find a way to defeat that. And where else to go than the country with the greatest navy in the world, which is England. If you guys remember that from the Age of Exploration, when they defeated the Spanish Armada, hint, hint. See how it all plays together? So in 1697 to 1698, Peter the Great goes to England to study shipbuilding and new technology. And while he's there, he basically learns Western culture, their clothing, and he's really fond of it. Like compared to Russia, this is all new to him. He's never seen it before this, and it's just very modern, and he likes the style. And him going to Western Europe was very monumental because he was the first Russian Tsar to ever leave Russia in 100 years. No other Russian Tsar had ever gone to Europe. Had ever gone to Western Europe. So basically during his time in Western Europe, he grew to admire the Western culture, and he wanted to emulate it. So I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to look at this picture of Peter the Great before I show you guys a new picture. And when I show you guys this new picture, I want you to see if you can tell any differences. Make sure to note some important things like Peter's hair, his facial hair, clothing, what he's laying on. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to do that. Okay, are we good? Yes? All right, so I'm going to pull up the next picture, and I want you guys to tell me in the chat any differences that you see. Immediately, any differences you see in the pictures. Okay, 3, 2, 1. So this is a picture of Ivan the Terrible, and I want you guys to tell me if you can see any differences in like their manner of dress, the way their hair is worn. Type any differences you see in the chat. Yes, his beard, that's very important. Good job, Julia. Anyone else see any differences? How about his clothes? Ivan's clothes are very different to the one that Peter the Great was wearing. All right, so the beard was a very good catch because Ivan's beard isn't really the clearness. Yeah, the robe versus Western uniform, that's really good. So I'm going to go over the kaftan. Good job. So I'm going to go over the pictures because while they might just be like portraits, they're actually very telling of Peter the Great's values and what he valued in Western culture and what he wanted to emulate. So here's a picture of Peter the Great again. And we can see here that Peter the Great has a sword, and this is a cannon. I believe that's a cannon. And here he's wearing very European style clothes, like English noble type of clothes. And he doesn't have a beard. That's a very important distinction, which he'll later force other nobles to follow in his footsteps of not having long beards. And he likes to be very lavish with his with the buttons and the accessories and stuff. So this is very telling of Peter the Great's, this is very telling of what he values from European culture. Also, the background is much clearer, and even though it's different time periods, and we know that different time periods have different art styles, like with the Renaissance and the Reformation, it's very telling that he wanted his portrait like this, which is a very Western European way of getting it done, basically. So if we had to summarize Peter the Great's work, his motivations in one word, it would be, well, not in one word, in 3 words, it'd be modernize Russian culture. So as I said before, he went to Western Europe and fell immensely in love with the way that the people there dressed and how advanced their military was and how educated the people were. So he wanted to emulate that in his country because he saw lots of faults with it. So I'm going to talk about his reforms, and this is like the most extensive slide. And although it doesn't look like it has much, he actually did a lot for Russia. So as we remember, as I said before, the reason why he went to Europe, Western Europe in the first place, was to establish a powerful standing army. Because, like I said, he wanted to expand Russia, just like his predecessor Ivan the Terrible did. They were both expansionists. And as expansionists, they want to expand Russian territory, right? So, but to expand Russian territory, he had to impede on other countries because Russia had already expanded a lot horizontally and had expanded all the way to the eastern coast already. So he had to expand to the west now. So he had to fight Holland and Turkey for land. And so he needed to establish a powerful standing army. And when he got to Western England, he saw, not Western England, when he got to Western Europe, he saw England's strong army and their navy, and he wanted to emulate their ships and their tactics, which is why he basically created a powerful standing army. He also established a civil service and created a Western educational system. So with all powerful standing armies, you need officers to control those armies, but those officers have to be disciplined and educated, and those were usually the roles of nobles. But Peter the Great isn't an absolutist for nothing. So a key aspect of absolutists is that they like to have the power all to themselves, and to have it all to themselves, you have to reduce the power of the nobles. So he reduced the power of the nobles, and as a result, because he reduced the power of the nobles, he just reduced the power of nobles because he's an absolutist, and he needs officers to educate, and those officers have to come from other places that can't just be nobles. So you have to learn to educate the common people too. That way they have discipline and they know how to read. And that's a very important part because he created schools. And schools would have a profound effect on Russia and their development throughout the years, especially in Europe. He created He created schools which helped educate people. And these schools weren't just for officers, though. They were also for technicians. For the other young nobles, he'd often send them to Western Europe, just as he did, to learn about English culture and bring back plans, bring back Western European ideas so that Russia could improve. Another thing he changed was the economic system of Russia. Well, he didn't really change it because it was still very much based on agriculture. He wanted to pull more mercantilist aspects into it, which is very important, by the way, because he was very much, as you remember from the Age of Exploration, mercantilism was basically the economic system that everyone had prized, and they were all following it. And So Peter goes to Western Europe. He sees mercantilism, sees how beneficial it is for all the countries, and he wants to bring that back to Russia because Russia is very poor. Only a few people have the wealth, and he wants to increase the wealth of the country. So yeah, he tried to install mercantilism, but it didn't really work out because you can't uproot agriculture overnight. We'll see that in the future when Stalin tries and it doesn't go very well. When he tries to rapidly industrialize and it doesn't go very well, you guys will see that in the future and during World War II. As I said before, he also tried to implement Western ideas. So one Western idea was that, as we can see from Peter's portrait, he has a very clean mustache, while Ivan the Terrible has a beard. And to get everyone, all the other nobles and everyone else to follow the beard, not the beard, to follow the mustache, or basically having a very clean face, he installed a beard tax. A beard tax. And this beard tax is basically, if your beard goes past a certain length, then you have to pay money for it or you cut it off. So, but nobles being the very, believing they have power equal to the monarchy, because everyone wants to be the monarch, especially like in Western European countries, everyone wants to be the monarch in Europe in total. These nobles would basically continue to grow out their beards despite the monarch's request, despite Peter's despite Peter's tax. And after it grew past a certain length, Peter gave some people permission to forcefully cut the beards off of these men. So that beard tax was one of the ways of him enforcing the Western ideas that he got from Western Europe. Another thing he did was place social restrictions on peasants. So as an absolutist, although he did all these great things for Russia, he also loved power. That's what absolutists do. They like holding power for themselves. And the reason why he's such a great example of an absolutist ruler is because he placed restrictions on nobles and peasants. But he also erected St. Petersburg, and they called St. Petersburg Russia's window to Europe because it was the closest city that they had to Western Europe at the time, and it was modernized. It had, as you can see in the next box, ornate Baroque buildings that were great that basically copied the buildings in Western Europe, because, like the palace that we've all seen in St. Petersburg, the very famous palace, it's very ornate, and that's a facet of Western architecture. And all of Peter's work basically established Russia as one of the major powers in Europe after his rule. Although Peter died fairly young and he left no heirs, so all his work restricting nobles was basically undone once he died because he had no heirs. He left no heirs. He did have an heir, however, he sentenced that heir to death and secretly executed him, which effectively kind of ruined his line of the Romanov dynasty. And once he died, all the nobles gained their power again because there's a little bit of turmoil. So Peter the Great's you should not consider him a horrible ruler, but he's also not. He had very profound effects on Russia, but he also did some pretty horrible things in terms of consolidating power and stuff. He enforced serfdom, which was horrible for peasants, and it wasn't until Alexander I that they would get rid of it. So yeah, this topic is fairly important. It appeared on last year's test, the one I took, and it was basically it appeared on last year's test, and it was basically one part of the SAQ. So it was basically one part of the SAQ, and it was the question on the SAQ that I did not get right. So hopefully you guys will get this right, because absolute Russia is actually important, and it's not just about Lenin and Stalin and those people in World War I. So do you guys have any questions? We can go over Peter the Great more, or any questions? So, like I said, major things that you should take away from Peter the Great's reign is that he did a tremendous job in elevating Russia's influence on the world stage, while England and France and Spain had already been England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire had already been huge powers. Like I said before, his creation of a Western educational system and the establishment of a powerful standing army really pushed them forward. No questions? Anyone have any questions? I can talk about how Russia plays into the test maybe, or the SAQ last year. So, like I said, with Peter the Great's death, it left Russia in a lot of turmoil. And during this time period, the Enlightenment's going to happen, which I'll be covering in a future stream. Oh, thank you. So, like I said, his death left a lot of turmoil because he killed his only heir. And as a result, the nobles were able to consolidate their power back. And into the future, because the Enlightenment's happening at the same time, we're eventually going to see the rise of Catherine the Great, and she's an enlightened absolutist. So it's important not to get the two mixed up when you learn about her. And so I'm going to show you guys the SAQ from last year. I'm going to show you guys the SAQ from last year, and hopefully we can go over a little bit of it together, because you guys might not know all of it, but it's just important to know. So here you guys go. This is the SAQ from last year. Hopefully you guys can read that. Let me focus it here. So here's the SAQ. I'm going to read it to you guys, and then we can go over it together. So it was the weakness of Russia's democratic culture which enabled Bolshevism to take root. The Russian people were trapped by the tyranny of their own history. For a while, the people could destroy the old system. They could not build a new one of their own. By 1921, if not earlier, the revolution had come full circle, and a new autocracy had been imposed on Russia, which in many ways resembled the old. So if you guys haven't done SAQs yet, and you've just been doing LEQs, or maybe you even done a DBQ already, SAQs stand for short answer question, and they're basically there's the responses they want you to give are very short and sweet. So 2 to 3 sentences, and the sentences have to be straight to the point. And so what I like to do is that I like to have my topic sentence, or basically like my context, be the first sentence, and then I like to have an example, like not my context, my answer, like a restatement of the question, and then my answer, and then an example, and then I like to explain how the example fits the question. So Absolute Russia pertains most to Part A, which says describe one piece of evidence that would support the author's characterization of Russia's political culture prior to the Bolshevik Revolution. So the Bolshevik Revolution is like the 1914s-ish, World War I during the middle of it, 1919s, 1920s. So definitely Absolutist Russia would count, because it talks about the autocracy. Well, not democratic. It talks about the old system, and you can infer that the old system is monarchy, is the monarchy, because Russia had no other kind of government before this. So can you guys tell me about Russia's old system? Can you guys write me like an answer to part A of this question? And then we can see if it would align with what the grader is graded on the AP test. No guesses? Okay, so I believe the grading is down here. Oh, no, they don't have any answers out yet, so it's definitely what you guys think. But if you don't have any guesses, that's fine too, because you guys haven't learned this far into anything yet. Me too, Zoe, me too. On the AP exam, I felt that too. So this was definitely the hardest question on the SAQ for me, personally. So you guys, what I put for this question wasn't, what I put for this question on the test wasn't from the age of absolutism. It was during World War I. But you guys might have some backgrounds on that, since you since you guys probably took world history and learned about the world wars and stuff and the Russian Revolution that took place between World War I. But I basically put the Duma for part A because it was a weak democratic form of government, basically. Part B and part C, I'm not going to tell you guys my answers because those were definite wrongs and you should not write what I put on the test. So I'm going to put another poll, guys, and I'd like you to answer. And then depending on your answer, could you give me a few reasons why? So the question is, do you think Peter the Great was a good ruler? Yes or no? And give me like one reason why that you either learned from the stream, or one reason no that you learned from the stream or you learned during class. So we have a yes, and then give me a justification in chat why you think he was a good ruler. And remember that Peter the Great did both good things and bad things. So there's definitely no right answer. Yes, that's a good okay, Julia. So Julia said that for an absolutist czar, he did good for Russia and modernizing various systems within the country. Yeah, that's a very good answer. Personally, I do think he was a good ruler for Russia because he did help modernize it, as you said, and he brought the country into the world stage. So it actually had a voice, and it having a voice will be very important when it comes to Napoleon. As you guys will learn with the Concert of Europe, it's very important for when Napoleon comes and tries to take over. Any other thoughts in the poll? Yes, no? Also, regarding the Western schools that he created, the schooling and educational opportunities that he created, it wasn't just for officers, like I said. It was also for people who, like nobles. It was for them if they wanted to go into crafts. It was also for people who wanted to go into trade, and he would basically teach them Western ways of doing things, Western ways of building, Western ways of making items, because he just felt that that was superior to the Russian version of doing it. And he's going to be one of those Russian rulers who tries to get Russia out of its agricultural, like its focus on agriculture, despite its very horrible climate. It's always cold there. Like, despite its geographical sort of natural not affinity for agriculture, he's going to try to move them out of that and get it more industrialized. Which is why he implemented mercantilism, but it wouldn't work, as you guys heard. So can you guys give me like what you consider one good thing, one good aspect of his rule and one bad aspect of his rule? Because even though he's a good ruler, absolutism comes with its ups and downs. And although this is the age of absolutism in Russia, yes, not allowing people the freedom to choose their own facial hair. Yes, that is a bad thing about his rule. So that's actually because, like I said before, Russia's set in its very old traditions and its old customs. And having a long beard was like a source of pride for men back then, nobles back then. So to cut it off was basically like defacing old culture. But in the name of progress, Peter the Great decided that he would tax based on beards, and if it grew too long, he would forcefully cut it off. The beard tax is a good it's like a good piece to use if they ask you, like, for an example of him exerting his power, because absolutist rulers like to exert the power over religious things. As I said, they are the state. They control religion, economy, politics, military, etc. Oh, we have a no. Okay. If you don't think Peter the Great was a good ruler, then why don't you think Peter the Great was a good ruler? Give me an example why you don't think he was a good ruler. Yes, execution and persecution of the old believers is definitely a very important thing that happened. Well, he's an absolutist. Also, he killed his own son, so that's definitely also not a good thing. So even though this stream is all about absolutist Russia, in total, during the age of absolutism, there's going to be three important, well, two, and then like a group of Prussian rulers, two important rulers, two people, and an important like family name group of rulers who are considered the absolutist poster childs, and those would be Louis XIV, as I said earlier, the Sun King, his iconic quote that we associate with the age of absolutism, that basically translates to "the state is me" or "I am the state." And he believed in divine right, which is also going to be a very important facet of absolutist rule. And then we also have the like I said, Peter the Great. He's going to be another. Yes, your daughter's correct. That's also bad, Mr. Beckman. Thank you. Tell her that's a very morally correct thing to think. So that's definitely bad. And that, as I said earlier, threw the country into turmoil, because if the monarch doesn't have an heir who gets the throne, always a problem. So, like I said, like I said before that, the three main monarchs that rulers that you should associate with the age of absolutism are Louis XIV, He was basically the one to screw everything over for France and launch it into the French Revolution, other than Louis XVI. Then we have Peter the Great, like I said here. While he was definitely doing good things for Russia, he expanded the monarch's power and limited the nobles' power and pushed constraints on peasants. And then the third are the Fredericks of Prussia. And I say Fredericks because there's multiple. So definitely important to know that they're also important figures in the age of absolutism. And these aren't supposed to get mixed up with enlightened absolutists, because enlightened absolutists are absolutists who try to implement enlightenment thinking in their teachings. Well, not their teachings, in their way of ruling. So consider the true absolute ruler of Russia to be Peter the Great if they ever ask you about specifically absolutism on the test. And although he erected St. Petersburg to emulate Western Europe because Russia had to look more modern, as I said, it's also to exemplify his reign and to show off the grandeur of it, which is why they're ornate. And Baroque is a very Western art style that came from the Counter-Reformation from the Catholic Church, because it was meant to inspire emotion and the Catholic people who looked at it. So that's a very, and the Catholic Church is in Italy, which is in Western Europe. So that's another very Western thing that he's implementing. So are there any questions about the AP test itself, maybe, or about, or anything about SAQs or LEQs or DBQs? Because absolutist Russia could definitely come up on the test in the form of Peter the Great. And it's just important to note that he helped modernize Russia and made it a world power. It made it a major power in Europe when before it was basically disregarded by all the other countries. And feel free to ask, because I was in your shoes last year and I definitely know how you feel. And this isn't a huge topic to cover on, because they won't test you on anything like Ivan. They won't test you on things like Ivan the Terrible and the Black Death, because it's too far in the past for our time period, for the time period AP Euro set in. But they will definitely test you on Peter the Great if they decide to, and and Catherine the Great, and how he affected Europe, and how she and he affected Europe. So feel free to ask questions. It's okay. No questions, none. Anything I need to clarify for you guys, that's okay too. It's not a very absolutist Russia isn't a very it's not a very deeply delved into topic in AP Euro. You're going to cover much bigger topics, but definitely know that from this point onwards, Russia has an important part in global conflicts in Europe, and we're going to see that in the Crimean War, which you guys will learn about, as well as the world wars. They're going to be very important with the amount of people they have in their country. So thank you. Music. Yes, and if absolutism comes up on that's a good point, Mr. Beckman. If absolutism comes up on the free response questions, definitely feel free to use Peter the Great as an example or Russia as an example to justify whatever point you're making. So thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I know there wasn't a lot of lecturing today, but again, thank you guys so much for coming. I really hope I taught you something, hopefully. And I hope you guys come to the next AP Euro streams as well. Bye.